Good afternoon, Brian. How you
Hi,
doing?
Elian. Good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you very well. Well, having a good day so far?
Yeah, not too bad.
Okay, great. Nice to hear that. Okay, I guess we can give it a few more minutes to
Yeah.
hope more people will log in.
Okay.
Hi, Brian.
Hi there.
How are you?
Good. How you doing, Mamadou?
Well, well, I'm doing good.
It's not looking like anybody's coming to this thing.
Well, it looks like we're the only one here
Yeah.
today.
Is Umar gay? I
Well,
thought, is he coming at all or no?
no, unfortunately,
Oh,
euh, il a un contretemps.
okay.
Euh, and I tried to invite Sidi Jamil. Do you know Sidi Jamil Nyan? No?
I might. I don't think so. No,
Okay.
I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting him,
He,
no.
yeah, but he told me that he's not very comfortable making a presentation in English. So it's kind of very
Okay.
complicated to find people.
Bah, c'est dommage, il y a que nous trois, non, il aurait pu. Il aurait pu le faire.
Hey, oui,
Bon,
bien sûr, bien sûr, bien sûr.
I hope somebody comes. I spent some time on this, but if not, I guess that's that.
Ok, Aline,
Yeah, yes.
est-ce qu'il y a il y a des pièces qui ont confirmé?
Effectivement, il y a quelques gens qui ont
Apparemment, on a
confirmé,
reçu le mail.
mais bon,
Hmm?
oui, oui, il y a des gens qui ont confirmé, mais bon, pour l'instant, il n'y a personne qui est venu. Donc, bon, il est déjà 15h07. Je ne sais pas, peut-être à 10, on commence. S'il y en a qui, some people join us on the way. Otherwise, Brian, I guess Dr. Bodian will play the role of the guest speaker.
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
I mean that's fine. I mean, Mamadou, you're a very good. I mean, you're a perfect interlocutor for the topic. So, if
yeah.
nobody comes, I would just do a short thing basically where I mean, I wrote kind of a whole, since when I saw that I was the only one on the bill, I thought,
Mhm.
oh, geez, well, then I better do something kind of a little bit more put together than just an informal 10-minute talk. And so that's what I did. And so I've got that. But if it's just us, I'll just talk to you guys about it. And Mamadou, I'd certainly be interested in hearing what you had to say.
Hmm.
Sure. Mm.
Well, that's very sad because I was expecting people to come in so that we can have a very good conversation. But
Yeah, it's a hard time of the year too. Time is very precious. It's frustrating to
yeah, I
spend so
can
much time
imagine.
on something
It's also true.
that doesn't happen.
But yeah. I mean, people confirm. I mean, I got some
Right?
people confirming, but then when it's time, you know,
Yeah.
more people.
Anyway,
But worst case scenario, Mamadou, you're a very interesting person. I mean, of course, Alioune, if you have anything to say as well, I'd be very interested to hear.
No, I mean, no. I mean, if you want to get started, you can go
Yeah.
ahead. But Brian, it's up to you. If you want to give us the whole presentation, since you worked on it, I mean, we'll definitely listen to it.
Oh, well, no, I won't give the whole presentation, but I will just
Okay.
I'll give you a rundown of
Yeah, it's whatever you're more comfortable with, really.
yeah, since especially it's right in sort of Mamadou's field, so
Okay,
I think you
okay.
so
Thank you. No,
basically, sure, I'm going to turn the video on because I don't like this picture of myself very much. Um, basically, my project is basically on extremism. I've been working on this so for a couple of years, whenever I can, as you both know, with research projects, we have to kind of fill them in the margins whenever we can, whenever we're not doing a million other things. And so this year has been really nice because I've gotten to sort of network with people who are working in the area that's of interest to me, both at the university level and at the sort of artistic level. But
hmm.
basically what I want to do here with this project, which I'm hoping, this is going to be over the next, 5 years or so, I think. I'd like to make a book out of it, just talking about how
Hmm.
theater artists in the Francophone world have dealt with the question of extremism, right? And I take extremism kind of in all of its forms. I'm specifically interested in France and West Africa. Since those are my areas that I have the most experience with. But you know, I would be looking at extremism in sort of the broadest sense of the term to include things like, you know, far-right extremism, especially, you know, in Europe, the rise of the far right, the sort of phenomenon of violent terrorist attacks in Europe, also the rise of extremism, violent extremism, which Mamadou knows a lot about in West Africa, for example, and also the kind of extremism that can lead to different forms of political instability and authoritarianism in the kind of coup d'etat. So that's kind of everything I'm putting under the blanket term, kind of uncomfortably under the blanket term of extremism. And my point, I'm not a specialist of extremism, but my point then to bring it to what my focus is on is to say that all of these things are connected somehow in a global sense. And that one of the advantages of theater artists' work in relation to extremism is that they're very good at showing how these things are connected. You know, so that's why I'm interested in theater in relation to extremism. And so, you know, I went into a little bit here to what kind of you know, some of the work on extremism, how some people you know, specialists have taken extremism as a kind of a broad thing where you can analyze different movements as falling within or as being different kind of manifestations of a general extremist mindset, and that can include a lot of different things. From far-right folks in Europe to, you know, violent extremism in West Africa, but also, you know, the Oklahoma City bombing in the United States in 1995, or Hindu nationalists in contemporary India, things like this. The idea being that they all fall under kind of a blanket term of extremism. And I recognize the kind of usefulness of that approach, but one thing that I add with this discussion through this discussion, I think of Francophone African theater and Francophone theater generally, is that historical context is, of course, very important. And you lose that when you look at extremism with too broad a perspective, right? Because especially in the case of the Francophone world, where you see, for example, all different kinds of extremism in different contexts, for example, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam discourse in France, or, you know, as you both are very aware, the kind of rising anti-French, well, I should say anti-French policy discourse in West Africa. All of these things can be seen in different ways as manifestations of extremism, but can we even imagine extremism of any kind in the Francophone world without considering the role of colonialism, right? Is it imaginable to have had extremism in the Francophone world without the history of colonialism? In fact, it's always there, even if it's not always brought up, if it sort of falls by the wayside in conversations about de-radicalization and radicalization and those kind of things, the actual specific historical context that feeds the phenomenon itself. And my point, coming back again to what my area of interest is and my specialty is, my point is to say that this is another thing that theater artists contribute to discussions because they're very adept at bringing conversations about colonialism back into the debate, where they tend to sometimes get lost a bit into the sort of social science discourse of what is it that pushes young men to fall into extremism, and, you know, that sort of generalizes things and takes the historical context away. So that, in a nutshell, was kind of the opening discussion that I was going to have. And the next question that I was going to answer here is, why should we be interested in theater when we talk about extremism, which seems to be something that should fall under the purview of social sciences and people who can actually do something about it, right? I say this in scare quotes, you know, and that's of course very important, but what does theater and what can the humanities add to that? And from the theater and performance standpoint, I point out that it's interesting, and this is a discovery. Oh, it looks like we have somebody. Hello. This was a hello.
Sorry, is this the closed session?
No.
Oh, okay.
Not at all. So one of the things that I noted in my research now looking into this, and that I found very interesting, was that in early studies of what we now might call security studies or sort of terrorism studies, performance and theater were actually very important conceptual tools in shaping those disciplines. So whereas one might ask, what use is theater when you're talking about extremism? In fact, the earliest scholars of extremism found theater and performance to be the best way to talk about their object of study. So, one of the founders, for example, of terrorism studies, what we might now call terrorism or security studies, was a social scientist who worked at the RAND Corporation, the RAND think tank in California, named Brian Michael Jenkins, who defined the field of terrorism early on in the 1970s by saying that terrorism, as we see it in this late 20th century, is a different form of war. It's closer, in fact, to an art form. It has an aesthetic quality in that what the terrorists are trying to do is not war so much as theater. What they're interested in, he said, was, quote, a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead, end quote. And from there, the field of terrorism studies arose as he described terrorists as, quote, choreographers of violence. And so these performance frameworks were foundational, actually, in defining the field that now explores, realities of extremism, terrorism, including far-right terrorism, where the conceptual tools of performance studies are very important. And so stepping back from that, I argue that theater artists have kind of shown that they're close to these discussions in the sheer fact that they are prolific producers of counter-extremist narratives. Theater artists are. Perhaps more than in other fields, artists of the stage have kind of seen it as a moral and artistic duty to respond to and combat extremist tendencies in their own context. This is something that I find is particular. It's not unique to theater, but I find it to be uniquely present in the theater world, which is we have to act, we have to do something, we have to resist this. You find it in other arts as well, but it's particularly present in the theater arts. For example, in France, there's a whole, and this is in a whole other aspect of my project that I won't get into, but there's a whole documentary theater trend in France that just works on creating kind of anti-fascist productions in France. So in a West African context, you see these sort of anti-extremist plays take the shape of different forms of dramaturgy, conventional stage dramas, and also interactive popular theater shows or forum plays that are often internationally funded and travel in search of a public. So they go out, oftentimes there either be sort of conventional plays in very kind of cosmopolitan venues, or popular shows that will be internationally funded and then sort of go out to seek a local public to whom they can perform their anti-extremist works. So in both the French and West African context that I'm looking at, the stage is being conceptualized as this kind of space of intervention, and the artists they're compelled in a near moral sense to react to the political realities of their day. And this comes from this particular context of France and the particular context of West Africa and their own theatrical traditions, which I won't go into here, but I do want to point out a key part of my project here, which is to say that these traditions of interventionist theater are very closely connected through, again, French colonial history, because the stage in West Africa, Francophone West Africa, served as an important tool in the propagation of the colonial project from the early 20th century to the very end of colonialism, to even up to the very end of it with the French cultural centers that were around the West African region. And so, I also wanted to bring up that connection as well, that this idea of theater as a form of intervention actually passed through the sorts of theatrical interventions that the French colonial administrators wished to make in the West African context. So all this is to say, not to condemn theater in one way or another, or not to just point out, the colonial legacies in theater in West Africa and as a way to dismiss it. African context. So one of the central questions, I'm sorry, I hope you're not losing me here. Can you hear me still okay?
Yeah, we
Okay,
lost you for
sorry,
a
my
couple of
internet.
seconds, but that's
Oh,
okay.
okay, sorry about that. It just told me that my connection was unstable. So one of the questions that I hope to explore through this project is whether that connection, that colonial connection between French colonialism and West African Francophone theater actually compromises in some way the theatrical stage as a tool for anti-extremism. And I think that you see this a little bit in theatrical events in different West African contexts, especially Francophone theatrical events, which tend to take on a kind of air, or at least are accused of taking on an air of elitism and distance from a quote unquote more local popular public. And is this kind of leftover of the colonial reality of this theater something that inhibits it from or prevents it from being able to perform any kind of anti-extremist role? That's the question that I'm asking, is does it have a negative consequence on the use of theater as a counter-extremist tool? Or does the theater's shared history with colonialism instead equip it, paradoxically and ironically, with certain tools that allow it to address extremist discourses? Are there unexpected ways in which this actually helps it to address extremism? And so just to sort of spice it up a bit, I thought I would, I put together a few slides. If you'd like, I can show you some of the shows that I am looking at, and I would just go through it really quickly, if that's okay. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, sure.
So, for example, here you have a fellow named Aristide Tarnagda, who's a Burkina Faso theater maker. He is a actor, director, and playwright, very important playwright, who is now also the director of Les Récréatrales, which is probably the most important theater festival in Francophone West Africa, or Francophone Africa, maybe generally. And he is very deeply engaged with anti-extremism, the current political and security situation in his country. So he has already made several works that deal very deeply with this question. So, for example, one is a show called Tu dis PDI, and PDI, as I'm sure everyone here knows, stands for Personne déplacée interne. I don't have to explain. I think I'm not going to explain to Mamadou Boudiane what that means. You know, I have a public here for whom that would be tedious. And so what he does, which is actually quite refreshing, what he does is he goes through these theatrical workshops with these people who have undergone horrific episodes of violence and who are deeply traumatized by them. And he puts on theatrical performances with them. They're a bit modest, but you know, they will involve dancing and a little bit of singing. It's not necessarily storytelling about what they've been through, because that would be too much. But it is a way for him to kind of integrate this population into the theater festival that he runs, which is a major cultural event for the country and for the region. So that's one way that he tries to work to kind of give a voice to these people. Another interesting performance that he has worked on is a theatrical adaptation of Terre Sainte, which I'm sure you've all heard of, from the novel by Mohamed Bougarsar. Now, what's interesting about his adaptation,
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has seen it. You know, I'm sure, you know, few of you, if not all of you, have read the novel. This is a picture from the theatrical production. And what Aristide Tarnagda does, which is interesting here, is he kind of flips the script on the overall narrative without changing any of the text. He kind of makes the whole play a little bit more sympathetic or empathetic of the plight of the radicalized son, who doesn't get much of a voice in the novel, but in the theatrical production is seen as not yet a lost cause, if you will. You know, it's interesting, Mohamed Bougarsar wrote this novel, as I wrote here, in 2014, as kind of a reaction and a shock to what was happening at the time in Mali. And here, this 2022 production of the novel reflects, I think, a kind of evolution in our point of view historically of what was going on at the region. Because whereas Bugarsar does not necessarily try to get us into the head of the radicalized individuals who are in his story. It's more a novel that speaks to the liberal-minded folks who were just in plain shock over what was happening. The theatrical adaptation tries more to understand Ismaila and what he's going through. And that turns out to be really productive. You know, I saw this production quite a few times in Ouagadougou, and it was quite effective among the young Burkinabe audience that was there, who were reacting to the scenes. So here you see Ismaila talking to his father, and his father is the one who looks a little bit more like the extremist here, but he's the one who's trying to talk his son out of extremism. And what Aristide Nagda explained to me was that he sees his father as kind of an extremist in the scene, and it's a way to kind of flip the script, and that's something that theater is quite good at. So I'll move along quickly. I know I've been taking up a lot of time here. Another very interesting show that is by Burkinabe theater maker, excuse me, is called Bonnière, l'Espoir de la Savane. And this is a children's show about sort of collective values in favor of peace and tolerance. And it's a very well-conceived show in that it's written in episodes. And what the creator, Paul Pingduende Zungurana, would like to do is turn them into television episodes to make it accessible for a young audience. So theater here is trying to create a kind of new mythology for its young population, very young, to help it sort of face the political realities of its country, of the country today. And then, you know, a Senegalese theater troupe who you folks might already know, named Kadou Yarach, has done some interesting work on anti-extremism as well in the Casamance region. And in that case, they were inspired by the personage, the figure of Thierno Bokar. So the idea was to create a kind of Thierno Bokar, who I don't have to explain to you folks who that is. Thierno Bokar, a figure facing extremism and rebutting extremism. And this is a very useful tool as well, in that theater has kind of at its disposal, which is to offer authoritative rebuttals to extremist discourses that motivate young people to sort of radicalize, if you want to say it that way. So that's another interesting production, and here's some images from that. Here I am in Côte d'Ivoire, very much still working on this this question here, but what is interesting is how here theatrical narratives are very much employed to try to make historical sense of the electoral crises that the country has recently been through in plays such as La Fille du Bistrot of Elie Diazere. The production of that is pictured here, and a very dynamic production called 220 Logements, which has toured quite a bit, and offers a story, takes the setting of a housing complex called 220 Logements in Abidjan, and its experience of the electoral crisis and the different sort of internal conflicts that have taken place in recent Ivorian history, and in the clear goal of trying to say, we're going to talk about this openly so that we can try to help prevent this from happening again. That's kind of the broader objective, I think, of the work. And so I'll stop sharing. So let me just wrap up here really quickly, since I'm the only person in the lineup. I've gotten to abuse my time quite a bit, but I'm only just going to make one point real quick, and then I'll be done. So all this to say, kind of my provisional conclusion here is a bit provocative, I think, but I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm just trying to point out what I think are less than obvious connections here. First of all, between the proximity of theater to colonialism, the way that rather impeding the art form from fulfilling its vocation, I think, of responding to extremism, it ironically equips it, I think, with powerful discursive tools. As I've tried to show, or I very rapidly and poorly showed, I think, in the examples above. You know, theater has the advantage of sharing the same space with its audience, and that's part of what makes it so useful. And from within that space, artists can propose alternative narratives or counter narratives to the ones that are used to facilitate extremism spread. Because if the studies of extremism talk about theater and performance so much, in part it's because extremism is something that's very much that survives on narrative. It's right, so it's kind of, and theater is very good at creating and spinning new narratives in a way. Let me just skip ahead a bit. Theater is also very good at theater artists in this West African context that I study are also very well equipped to acknowledge and express the grievances that lead young people, especially, to be pulled to extremism or extremist paths, right? And theater can facilitate authoritative rebuttals of the interpretations and readings of texts and political realities that succeed in drawing individuals to extremist ideology. So lastly, and this is the very last point that I'll make, there is a dynamic at work that is, I think, specifically in Francophone African theater that can make theater artists equipped to respond to theater in particularly dynamic ways. The theater of Francophone African works along transnational channels. So Francophone African theater is a very transnational world with a wide range of international involvement and influence. In a way, like extremist actors, they have an ambiguous and tenuous relationship with the state and with colonial histories. And they operate with an eye towards local interests while keeping an eye towards their place in a global artistic world. In short, what I'm trying to say is that there are actually similarities in how theater artists circulate their work and in how extremist discourse sort of circulates within colonial histories and in very transnational and dynamic ways. And then this surprisingly allows theater artists in Francophone Africa to respond to extremism in the kind of dynamic ways that are necessary. In other words, if the post-independence Francophone African theater of the 1960s and 70s had succeeded in making this great centralized national theatrical culture scene that it was trying to create, that kind of theater would have been far less adept at responding to the contemporary realities of extremism than the far more transnational and sort of dislocated theater that you have today. And that's my final point. And so on that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. This was very, very
Thank you so much, Brian.
interesting.
Thank you.
Very insightful.
Thanks, Brian. It was great.
Thank you, Fatima. Oh, it's that Fatima?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Fatima. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you? How are you,
Good,
Aline?
good.
How are you?
Doing good, Fatima. How are you? Nice
I'm
to
well,
have
thank you. But this was very interesting. When I saw the email, I was like, I definitely have to attend this. Sorry, I joined a little late.
That's okay.
But I think it's interesting. I don't think I've ever thought about terrorism in relation to like theater or drama or anything like that. So it was very interesting. And especially when you said that terrorists kind of their attacks are very like artistic in a way, in not wanting to kill people, but wanting people to watch to garner attention. And I think that's something that people often forget in relation to like terrorist attacks and terror organizations and things like that. But then connecting it back to, or linking it to theater, definitely, that was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean thank you. That wasn't my idea. That's kind of how the field of when they began trying to sort of get to the bottom of the reality of terrorism back when it was sort of evolving into what we know today, I guess in the 1970s. That's how they started talking about it, specifically with one scholar in particular who launched this aesthetic approach to understanding terrorism, and that marked the field for a very long time. But yeah, I found that incredibly interesting. I did not know that was the case, and so when I was researching on this project and I found that connection, I found it very interesting. I found it a little concerning as well, because when you work on theater, you're not used to thinking about it in relation to something like terrorism, and also yeah, so it's just something I've been thinking about quite a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know you're based in Abidjan also, and I don't know if you had a chance to attend the Massa Festival last month,
I
but there
did.
were I did get a chance to attend on the last day, and I did visit this one theater dance play, and it was the Rwanda Arts Initiative.
Yeah.
And it was basically, it was a dance slash theater play that kind of went through terrorist acts that took place in Rwanda, and based on like a specific just one family and one individual, and his mother played a large role. But I think that was the first time that I'd ever seen any type of drama that was like directly related to terrorism in that way also. So it was very interesting to see that.
Yeah. I unfortunately I missed that particular show. But yeah, I know exactly which one you're talking about. So I'm glad you caught it. Sounds like it was
Yeah,
very interesting.
it was. But that's all for me. This is a very great presentation.
This is
Thank you,
cool.
Fatima.
Brian, I really like your take this, and I think it challenges basically the way I think about terrorism, because we political scientists and special experts in security matters, we tend to look at this kind of physical violence, but also how human security issues also impact, um, at least, shape how terrorism or violent extremism evolve, or and your presentation gave heritage. You talk about French colonialism, but also from another perspective, I'm just wondering to what extent the influence of the Arab world as well, yeah, but also how ideas circulates can also shape the way we interact with those phenomena, right? So is there any middle ground between a sort of métissage between uh, those different heritages when it's come to shaping people's understanding, but also the way they deal with ideas associated with violent extremism?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry. I think it cut off for a second there, so I didn't get the whole thing. But did you so is there on my end? Sorry, it seems my internet connection is not super stable. But the question is there any métissage in the sort of heritage that leads to this kind
Yeah.
of theater? Is that...
Mm.
Yeah, oh, certainly. It's almost all a kind of métissage, and in a way, I think that's what that's what theater artists sort of have in common with the purveyors, the sort of actors of extremist movements in a very weird way, is that it's based on a kind of métissage. And now again, I feel weird putting those two together, both the extremist actors and the people who are kind of against them. But I feel like maybe it's that theater artists are one thing that they're really experts at is a form of empathy that runs very, very
Mm.
deeply, and that allows them to really get a deep understanding of the perspective of those who wind up following what we might consider an extremist path. And so in the interviews that I've had with people who work on these questions, the work almost always starts from a perspective of understanding what it is that leads people along
Mm.
that path, right? And
Mm.
that I find to be very rare in approaches that will try to engage in any kind of counter extremist measure. And so is that
Mm.
aesthetic? Is that political? I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. There certainly is a degree, I think, though, in terms of the heritage of all this, of métissage, for sure.
So, okay. So Aline?
Yes.
I also want to contribute
Mhm.
just a little bit by um, talking about terrorism, but this time in relations to, you know, all the situation, the military coups in the Sahel region.
Right.
I'm going to make a quick presentation just to as a supplement to Brian's presentation, but from a
Great.
different perspective.
Wonderful.
Um, Aline, j'espère que je vais pouvoir te présenter.
Bien.
Oui, je pense bien.
Tu utilises toujours ton portable?
Oui, c'est bon.
Ça marche?
C'est bon, vous voyez?
Oui.
Euh, oui, c'est bon.
Ok, super.
Ouais.
So I want to talk a little bit about military coups in the Sahel region in the context of the fight against terrorists. It has become a main topic today because these military coups are also creating a very big confusion as in terms of what kind of connections exist between the situation of insecurity, but also the propensity of some actors in militaries in particular to take over power by using this the situation of insecurity as an excuse, right? So I'm going to be talking about these different points, but very quickly. As an intro, this is the 2022 Global Terrorism Index that indicates, for example, that around the globe, most of incidences of terrorism are recorded in the Sahel region of West Africa. So I'm going to come into this later on, but just to provide an overview. And there is also a kind of some link between violent extremism and terrorism, even though when we talk about violent extremism, we tend to focus on you know, everything related to belief, but also actions that individuals or group who support or use violence to achieve their ideological or religious or political goal. And usually we talk about violent extremism in relation to some drivers or factors, right? It can be economic, political and social, but also psychological issues that can sometimes lead to a sort of radicalization, mainly people adopting radical ideas, and this sometimes lead to terrorism, which is the use of violence or threat of violence to instill fear. So that's basically one of the difference between violent extremism and terrorism. So usually terrorism is associated with the use of tactics which involve bombing, shooting, kidnapping, and other form of violence attack. And Brian, you talk about different types of terrorism, and this is a typology that have been provided by Statista in 2023. So they show that there are different types of terrorism, going from far right to far left, but also have anarchists. We have ethno-nationalism or separatists, which sometimes can use terrorism. And today, and I think more and more, the jihadi dimension of terrorism is becoming more and more one of the most prevalent aspect that people emphasize on for various reasons. Oops. Okay. So these are the different types. We have a political terrorism, criminal, but also all this mafia, and I think Latin America is well known for, but also Italy, some for some, in a sort of, sometimes people talk about all these criminal gangs also using terror as a way to spread their influence, but also trying to control political elites. You also have separatists, so I mentioned it earlier, but religious-based terrorism is one of the most prevalent. So there are many contributing factors, some of them, especially in West Africa, being the weak state institutions, because the state being incapable of projecting its capacity, but also providing security, securing people and goods is one of the one factor that opens the door to non-state actors positioning themselves as providers of security services. And you also have porous borders and illicit trafficking. And there are other factors of vulnerability associated with the state incapacity to provide basic services, education, health. And today, especially in the Sahel region, climate change and environmental degradation is also one of them, because it led to competition over scarce resources, which also basically make salient past tensions and conflict between community, and especially between farmers and herders. So what's the situation of terrorism in the region? So as you can see in this map, this is not something specific to West Africa, but I think over the last few years, West Africa has become one of the main, especially in the Sahel region, has become one of the main hotspots, the main terrorist hotspot, because of all these militant Islamist group operating in the region, right? Although we also have other groups operating in Nigeria, but also Northern Africa. And today, more and more, we also have some regions like South Africa, Mozambique, which is now cited as one of the main area where terrorism is spreading. But one of the theories that have been put forward is that terrorism, the map of terrorism is also following the map of resources, which somehow makes sense if you look at, for example, how these terrorist organizations operates. But I'm not going to emphasize this aspect. So what I want to stress is the fact that over the last few years, we've seen an evolution in attacks associated with terrorism. For example, from 2007 to 2022, the Middle East and North Africa region is considered to be the region where most incidences of terrorism are registered or recorded. But over the last few years, Sub-Saharan Africa has become one of the main hotspots, as you can see here. And in 2022, 40% of terrorist incidences are recorded in West Africa. And Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are particularly affected by this factor. For example, here you can see fatalities linked to militant Islamist group in Africa by theater. So you can see the Sahel region, but also the Lake Chad Basin in Somalia and Mozambique and North Africa, right? So here you see, for example, the share of these three countries that I cited early on, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, with the nexus between organized crime, terrorism is characterized by activities such as cattle rustling, but also livestock, which is one of the main drivers of economy. And gold mining is also becoming one of the main target, in addition to other types of criminal activities, drug trafficking, kidnapping, and ransom demands. So we can see, for example, how this border region between Niger, Mali, Burkina, known as the Liptako-Gourma region, is now one of the area where most incidences are recorded as well. So what about military coups? So we've seen, for example, that over the last few decades, from 1990s to 2022, military coups have become recurrent, especially in some countries, Mali, Burkina, Niger, Chad, and Guinea-Conakry, and Guinea-Bissau as well. But as you can see on this diagram, successful coups are particularly recorded during the in the early 1990s. Although there are many failed attempts, but what is more surprising is what happened from 2020 to 2022. As you can see here, we've seen, for example, from August 2020 to February 2022, we've seen the resurgence of military coups in Mali, but also in Chad, in Niger, and sometimes during the transition in a particular country, we've seen a military coup occurring as well. So, and this also tells a lot about how the civilians and the military and the military collaborates, because most of these countries are known for having experienced a very challenging transition to democracy, because democracy means moving from a non-democratic regime to a democratic regime, and this also implies that the country implement electoral reforms, but also hold elections, regular elections, with a multi-party system. But this is not enough. There has to be a guarantee to a set of freedoms, freedom of expressions, freedom of religion. But we've seen that in many countries, these freedoms are not guaranteed. But also the military lurk behind the political arena. And whenever there is a political, debt, or let's say institutional deadlock, or when there is some kind of political instability, they just get involved in the political arena. And this is what happened in all these countries. And once the military established themselves, it's become very complicated to kick them out. As you can see, for example, here in Mali, where the transition has derailed, because since the military coup, we all, everybody was expecting the transition to end, right? In February 2022, but 2 years later, we're still in the transition. So this makes the security situation even more complicated, and especially in this context where all these military regimes have tried to build a sort of alliance and try to protect themselves using sometimes repression, but also censorship as a way to govern. So now if you try to look at, for example, how these military coups are linked with the terrorist activities, you can see, for example, here, in Mali, for example, that the military coup, there's kind of following the two military coup d'etat, militant Islamist groups in Burkina, but also in Mali, right? Somehow, but in Burkina in particular, have moved to encircle Ouagadougou, leaving basically a trail of unprecedented violence in their wake. And you can see, for example, how as we move, as time goes on, violence spread, especially battles between different factions, but also between the military and those extremist groups. Remote violence also is very prevalent today, and violence against civilians is also one of the main something that have been recorded also. So here you can see, for example, in Mali, how military attacks, especially in central Mali, have become more and more complex because you have tensions between the National Liberation Front, especially in central Mali, where tensions between these Islamic groups and the Malian military, but also other peacekeeping missions, which have now kind of having had hard time confining the spread of violence. And today, with Mali breaking its the military cooperation with France, but also other Western allies, the situation is getting more complicated. And the fact that the Malian transitional regime call upon other groups like Wagner is today considered to be one of the main threats, because there's been many incidences of human rights violations. Okay, so I'm gonna go quickly. So most of the strategies to curb the spread of violent extremism tends to focus on hard military options, but unfortunately, many Sahelian countries are militarily speaking very weak. So if you look at, for example, here, the world's most powerful militaries, the US, Russia, China, India, and Japan, if you compare them to the most powerful countries in Africa, like Egypt, you can see the gap and the difference. Countries like Niger, Mali are, under-equipped, and the military forces are also under-trained to handle all this this new form of threats associated with terrorism. So I'm gonna move quickly. So if you look at, for example, this map, this is a CIPRI's world military expenditure by region. If you look at the top African countries, are the one who put less money in military expenditure. So they don't have the necessary equipment, but also the means to handle all these security threats. That's why I think some of them have tried to invest in some kind of collaborations with Western countries, but also develop institutionals, military institution or academies as an alternative. But this is not enough. But we also have regional organizations that also help secure the region, including, for example, ECOWAS interventions sometimes. But unfortunately, when it's come to handling security matters associated with terrorism, there are limitations. And the Accra Initiative, but also the G5 Joint Force, or the Multinational Joint Task Force, all these initiatives have limitations, because terrorism is something very difficult to fight, especially if you don't know the root causes. So, and international actors are now kind of very, find it very difficult to arbitrate between conflicting priorities. And people are more and more concerned about human security than, hard security. So, and we also have foreign military intervening. France, for example, present in many countries, including Senegal, but also other forces like Takuba Task Force, which are now kind of kicked out, and in Niger and Mali and in the Sahel. And now Wagner is coming in, trying to help these countries face the challenges, security challenges. So I just want to conclude by just emphasizing a couple of maybe solutions, one of them being regional corporations. Because many regional organizations, as you know, are not capable of helping their member state come up with all these challenges. So enhancing corporations is something very fundamental when it's come to responding to this terrorism, but also political instability. International partnership is very important, but I think it can be sometimes limited because international partners also define the Sahel based on their geostrategic interests. So how can you arbitrate between national interest and the interest of these foreign partners? That's one issue. Strengthening state capacity is for me very important as well, because one of the reasons why the Sahel is in this situation is that the state is not capable of basically having the monopoly of legitimate use of violence, and it's being in competition with other providers of security services. But how to strengthen the state, but also the military apparatus and the security apparatus in general, and tackle other structural challenges such as corruption and governance, bad governance. And now another issue is basically fostering dialogue, kind of a bottom-up approach to conflict resolution. And economic development is also a main challenge that sub-Saharan African countries, but also Sahelian countries in particular, should invest in. Technology advancements is also something to very important today. And I know that the US have been very efficient when it's come to providing intelligence at some point, especially in Niger. But now that they are leaving, we don't know what's going to happen. So this is the kind of contribution that I want to bring to this conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bodian. That was great.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
That was a real treat because, there are the specialists working on this really have the kind of granular knowledge that you have on this issue is so incredibly helpful. And I just want to check, Alioune, this recording, will it be accessible to us? Because I know that I would love to take another look at those slides and that presentation at some point.
Yes,
yes, even the slide will be available. So I'll give it to Alioune.
Wonderful.
Okay, we'll share that with you later.
Great.
I did have some questions.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Fatima. Sorry. No, you go ahead.
Wait, Dr. Bodian. I'm sorry, Fatima. Dr. Bodian, could you share your slides on the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and the recording, whenever it's done, I'll share it with both Brian and Fatima.
Just a second.
Thank you. Sorry, Fatima. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a question, Dr. Bodian. I actually have a few questions, so bear with me. The first one is you mentioned the new junta blocks that have formed in the Sahel region, and I was wondering what are some potential weaknesses that the new bloc faces? And second question.
One of the main.
Yeah.
Sorry, the first question.
the first question was, what are some weaknesses or gaps that the new junta blocks in the Sahel are facing or might face? If that makes sense.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So you say one of the main challenges or the main that the
Yeah, it could
state
be
are
the main challenges or just some challenges that they are facing now or they will face. You think they will
okay,
face?
okay, I got you. Well, I think the challenges are numerous, and I think one of them being the capacity of the state to perform its regalian function. And I think that's maybe one of the, because people in the periphery who are trying to look at opportunities, including criminal opportunities, are in reality have been left behind for many years. They are not included in the. They don't have access to basic services, and I think what they're asking is more road, more job opportunities, more access to infrastructure, health infrastructure. And that's why, if you look at, for example, what is happening today in the central region of Mali, Ségou and Mopti, where the Katiba Masina and Amadou Koufa are kind of spreading their influence. In fact, what makes them efficient, and I think one of CIPRI's report did a good job in kind of highlighting the reasons why people are more sympathetic when it's come to supporting jihadists, is that they're very efficient when it's come to providing some services. I'm going to give one example. For example, there's been some a kind of trial between farmers and herders that have been left without being solved for many years, and these groups have been able to solve those problems. And another thing is, when you get your cattle stolen, you just have to show them a photo of of one cow or something like that. They will just use their networks to recover the cattle. But in return, you have to pay something, right? It's kind of a protection racket. So this efficiency is some of the thing that also create some kind of sympathy, but also connection between people and those population who've been really excluded from the national economy, not enjoying any opportunity provided by the state. So that's one example. But the other one, which I think is a big challenge, is this demographic growth that is also becoming a challenge, because if I believe that over the next few years, or decade, if you may, because if Sahelian states are not capable of handling the challenge associated with this massive flow of people coming and looking for job opportunity, there will be some pressure, and one of the kind of very problematic exit would be migration or joining this kind of extremist group. That's one of the fear. So if you don't control this kind of demographic dividend, if you don't invest in education, in health, and allowing people to enjoy opportunity that can help them have a decent life, they may be tempted to finding alternative means to make a living. But there is also other challenges, and I think today, especially in this context where the pressure on land is a big issue. So, and this demographic challenge is also will manifest itself into tensions and conflict over scarce resources, land. And today, with this, the influence of climate change, we've seen, for example, how tensions between herders and farmers are kind of increasing. And all these extremist groups have, they are aware that one of the main resource is, forest, but also controlling lands and water, controlling land and water. So if you look at, for example, how they are kind of trying to control some parks, the Park W, I don't know if you're familiar with this, is becoming, another hot spot. Because if you control the forest, you control resources, and then you control all the circulation of people. And it's an indication of power as well.
Thank you. And I have two more questions. I'll try to like morph them into one. So this is kind of a loaded question also. Given what's going on we know what's going on here on the continent, in the Sahel region with all the new blocks, junta blocks forming, but this has been happening for the last several years. Several coups have been popping up and restarting. However, now we have other factors, other global factors like the Russian and Ukraine war, as well as the Israeli Gaza war. So is there a possibility for, well, first, in your opinion, do you think or believe there has been a shift in politics towards, well, just a general shift in international politics, but more specifically, do you think there's been a shift that symbolizes a shift towards like Cold War politics, if that makes sense? And is there a possibility for proxy wars to happen here on the African continent, especially when you have forces like Wagner and Russia and China who are also trying to, and the United States as well, who are also trying to spread their influence in the region? And the last question, you mentioned at the end of your presentation that there should be a bottom-up or a bottom-top approach in addressing these coups. And do you think that, I guess, the reception of the coups that are happening now are any different in terms of from the constituents? Do you believe like the constituent reception of coups are any different than they have been in the past? And does this make a difference in the success of a coup in a specific country? I know those are a few different questions put together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, there's been well, for the first question, and I think there's been a shift in the interest that many Western countries have in terms of helping African countries, but also Sahelian countries in particular, to come up with this insecurity, which has started in 2000, since, it's kind of that is spreading since 2010 or 11, if you want, following the fall of Gaddafi's regime. But I think there's something also that's worth mentioning, which has contributed in making the intervention unpopular. One of them being a sort of narrative that have been developed by some activists, but also some unpopular regimes who try to depict Western intervention as making the situation worse. And I think the Ukrainian war have complicated the relationship between African countries and and Western countries. And one example being this argument that for a decade, African countries have been advocating to mobilize funds and resources to help handle this threat associated with terrorism. But even the G5, the G5 Sahel joint force was not capable of, benefiting from the support of Western countries. But if you look, for example, what happened in Ukraine, the amount, but also the energy that have been put in helping Ukraine face the Russian threat, it's incredible. And I remember listening to Mamadou Yusufu, the former president of Niger, saying that, well, what we're asking to Western countries is not to help us, but to come solve the problem that they caused in Libya, which was the driver of everything that the Sahel is facing right now. So and you also have all these movements, movement against France, this colonial power, France dégage, le balai citoyen. And this all happened in the context of awareness of African elites, especially young people, to kind of make a sort of shift in the relationship between Africa and Western countries, especially France, right? Even though initially the French military have been applauded for helping at least Mali stop the progress of the Islamists, right? But later on, the intervention have become popular because one of the arguments that people put forward is that we can't understand how the country that has the most military forces on earth is also the country that face most of insecurity incidences. So what's the point of having all this military? MINUSMA, the FAMA is there. You have the G5 Sahel joint whatever, and EUTM, you have EU CAP. So all these militaries are not capable of handling the jihadi threat. So, and people started asking questions, and all these conspiracy theories started emerging, right? So that's one issue, right? And Russia understood that there is a shift in the region, and it uses basically Wagner as a proxy to advance its political goals. I attended a seminar where, on vigilante groups, and someone made this argument saying that Putin is very good at helping some kind of a paramilitary, but also groups that can help him reach its goals, especially internationally, but also getting rid of them once they start causing trouble, right? And Wagner played this role because they started intervening in Central African Republic, and then later on in other countries, including Mali. And so, but at the same time, he knows how to play with this, using its kind of these groups as a leverage to advance its political but also economic goals, without appearing as someone who has these imperial pretensions. So the picture is very mixed, but what I can say is that, of course, there is a kind of a shift toward Ukraine, and this is also this has been complicated by a narrative against Western countries, but also a narrative on the lack of kind of coordination between different interventions. So each intervener comes with his Plan Sahel, The US have his Plan Sahel with USIP, and then you have La France as son Plan Sahel. So everybody comes with his Plan Sahel, but there is no coordination between those different Plan Sahel and, national strategies. And this also didn't help really create an environment that allows cooperation between different actors in terms of fighting against terrorism. So that's my take. The last question is it a, sorry, Fatima, I'm kind of.
Yeah, no. So the last, and thank you for that last response. And the last question was kind of a follow-up to the ending of your presentation, and where you said there should be a bottom-up approach
Yes,
to address these.
yes.
Mhm. So the question was,
Yes.
what has the reception of these coups been to the constituents of these countries? Are they accepting of it? Are they unaccepting? And if they are accepting, I guess, how does their reception of the new leadership play into the success of it, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, I think there's been and we've seen, for example, that the military have been enjoyed some kind of popularity when they took over power. And I think this is partly because their intervention come at a time when those countries are facing many challenges, especially security challenges. So Mali, we know what happened. Ibeka was unpopular because of the way he handled this political and domestic situation, especially corruption at some point. But also all these mass demonstrations led by many movements, of course, one of them being anti-Abana movement. And then later on, you have the involvement of religious actors in collaboration with civil society organizations. So at some point, Ibeka was losing momentum in a context where the security situation is getting fragile. So what the military did is basically to end a cycle of political tensions that may create an opportunity for other forces to destabilize the country. So is it a good thing? I think maybe at that time, some people may argue that this was a good thing, because if you don't have a legitimate government that people can rely on, it can be very detrimental to the stability of the country, which was very fragile at that time. But I think the situation is very different in Niger, where the military junta was just acted, opportunistically. I don't know if I can use this word, because it was, of course, there's been tensions between the military and the new regime, Bazoum regime after Mamadou Youssoufou left, but it's not, they didn't perform this military coup because the security situation was getting out of control, but it was because Bazoum wanted to engage a set of reforms that may be detrimental to the military. So, but I think the problem, it's not whether the military have taken over, but what also strengthened the legitimacy is the reaction of the ECOWAS and other states, which threatened to intervene militarily. So this has created a sort of a kind of a sort of alliance between the military and other forces, who also find an opportunity to the military also, right, use this as an opportunity also to strengthen its hold, and this make the situation more complicated. But of course, in Burkina, since 2014, the country was unstable, and the military was seen as an alternative to political elite who have been incapable of handling the security situation, which was getting complicated, especially in the northern part of the country. And at some point, the military, the regime, tried to rely on militias as they was kind of having a hard time projecting the military might to secure some parts of the country. So, and I think the picture is very mixed. In some countries, Burkina and Mali, the military enjoys some legitimacy at some point, but I think now the situation is getting different because they're facing criticism. And in Mali, I think it was a few days or yesterday, I can't remember anymore, they dissolved some civil society organizations, including l'Association des élèves et étudiants musulmans du Mali, because they started criticizing the regime. And I think the popularity is going down now because people are facing many challenges, economic challenges, getting access to a job, and the military is not capable of delivering the services, and electricity, access to electricity is becoming a nightmare in Mali and in Niger. So, and what is getting the situation worse is that they kicked everybody out, including humanitarian organizations and other partners. And this makes the situation more complicated for the military. So I don't know how long it's going to take, but I believe that this is not going to last for very long. That's my take. I may be wrong, and I wish I am, but unless they use repression.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Can I just ask one question? Thank you for that very, very interesting presentation, which I'll be looking over again in the slides. And I had just one maybe theoretical question, which is when you, in your presentation, and it's something that people talk about quite a bit and comment on, there is this spread of terrorism, extremism, coups throughout different parts of the world, including, Africa, West Africa. But there is a remarkable presence of former French colonies in those groups. So, and I wondered if there are any theories in political science as to why that might be. Why is there this particular Francophone African narrative taking place in West Africa that is different from what's happening in, say, the places like Nigeria or Ghana? And are there any ideas? Does that have something to do with colonialism, or is it just really related to more contemporary realities?
Well, I think people convey colonialism to justify some kind of the necessity to redefine our relationship with France in particular. And one of the reasons, or some of the arguments that people are kind of putting forward, is that for so long, we've been under French yoke, which control our political elites, who are not capable of delivering, corruption, good governance are becoming prevalent. So, and the need to shift our relations with our former master, quote unquote, the diversifying opportunity for partnerships has become also one argument. But I think the presence of France, which has, which has become so cumbersome. I don't know if I can say that. And I think in Mali in particular, it has been, we can see, for example, how even when it's come to security, France is the one who called the tune. G5 Sahel is France. So EUTM, so France has become the entry point. And we've seen how even the security of the country itself, France was so vocal. And there are parts of Mali where even the farmer couldn't get access. So it was a territory controlled by France, especially not in some part, the northern part of it. But I think there is a kind of geopolitical reason, because France is also exploiting the uranium in Niger. It makes sense to secure those, the border between Niger and Mali, but also making sure that workers in those sites are not kidnapped, because kidnapping has become a very lucrative business. So I understand that for geopolitical reason, but as a way to secure French interests in the region, that they project their military might, but also make sure that those areas are controlled. But it created a lot of frustration, even among the military, who started basically expressing its frustration to see the farmer not being able to access some areas. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that France has opted for a counterterrorism strategy as opposed to engaging with communities. And the use of force have created also many consequences, because the targeted assassinations of some, let's say, terrorist leaders had also, unpredicted consequences, because some communal leaders have been killed, which also increased people's frustration, especially in northern Mali. So you have this kind of confluence of factors, which also started, amplifying this perception that France is not here to secure people, but to secure its own interest. I don't know if you remember, at some point, people started basically even criticizing the MINUSMA, and but also France. And Macron was forced basically to react by asking, the G5 Sahel leaders to determine themselves, to say whether they want France to be around. The meeting at Po was a reaction to those criticism, and later on they realized that the military intervention is not a solution, and that they have to balance between military intervention or hard security and human security, which many countries like Sweden, but also all these Nordic countries have kind of suggested, right? Because you can kill a terrorist, but you can't make the reason why they engage in the terrorist activity disappear. So the best solution, since the fight against terror is not yielding the expected outcome, we should think about the strategy. So it's mostly a human security strategy. So how to make sure that people have access to, basic needs, job, employment, but also access to infrastructure that are one of the reasons why they become very vulnerable to recruitment by extremist organizations. So that was a kind of, and the other thing which also contributed in alienating people is when Ibeka at some point decided that maybe we should dialogue with all Malian people, including those they consider terrorists, right? Because the initial dialogue, the Alger agreements in 2015, I think, didn't include some quote unquote terrorist organizations, right? There was kind of some selected organization that was included in the negotiation. But how could you negotiate with actors who are considered to be the most powerful in those areas? So if you don't include them, then you're not solving anything. And I think that's what happened. So, and later on they realized that this is a mistake. So you can't just exclude some actors and pretend that peace will prevail. And Ibeka at some point decided that maybe we should talk with these terrorists. And I think International Crisis Group also wrote a paper, a very interesting paper, negotiating with the bad guys. And one of the main suggestions is to negotiate with jihadists. Not all of them, but at least those who consider themselves to be Malians. Iyad Agali, Kufa. They are not foreigners. They are Malian people who decided to rise up against the state. But how could you create an environment that allows them to participate in a very fruitful dialogue? But France was not in favor of this dialogue. So that was one of the breaking points between the French authorities and the Malian people. I'm not talking about Malian authorities, but the Malian people who started questioning the true intentions of France.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, it's a very confusing situation in the region.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time, Brian and Dr. Vodian. These were both really great presentations. I learned so much, and they were very informational and helpful to the work that I'm doing now. So thank you.
Thank you, Fatima.
No problem.
All right. Hopefully see you soon in Abidjan sometime.
You too. Bye-bye.
Right.
Okay, Aline, I think.
Brian.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. It was a.
Thank you.
It was.
Thank you, guys. Very good
Sorry
job.
that people say, but this is fantastic.
It wound up being really terrific. Just learning about your work and getting your feedback as well and to see Fatima and Alioune. So thank you. There was an afternoon well spent for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both. Bye-bye.
Thank you for everything, Brian.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ciao, ciao.